A 7-year-old sits at a low wooden desk, back straight, both feet flat on the floor. In front of her, a blank sheet of graph paper and a single pencil. No ruler, no eraser. The teacher calls a number, 347 times 68. And the girl's hand moves, not slowly, not carefully, fast in the way that means the process has become reflex. 18 seconds later, she sets the pencil down. She doesn't check her work. She already knows it's right. Her classmates are still writing. The camera holds on her face, completely calm, completely ordinary, because to her, this isn't impressive. This is Tuesday. What you're about to see isn't a story about pressure or tiger moms or rote memorization. It's a story about a set of cognitive tools that were once considered basic, and what happened when half the world quietly stopped teaching them. Start with the most fundamental one. Every morning in classrooms across China, students open a notebook and do arithmetic by hand. Multi-digit multiplication, long division, problems that take sustained mental effort to hold in the head. No calculator on the desk. No phone to reach for, just the problem, the pencil, and the brain working against a clock. The research on this has been accumulating for years. Daily timed arithmetic builds working memory in ways that device-assisted calculation structurally cannot replicate. Western classrooms largely handed that cognitive function to calculators and apps before the neuroscience was settled. The devices arrived, the drills disappeared, and a generation later, educators are still trying to figure out what else left the room when the pencils did. But the math doesn't stop at numbers. That's not even the impressive part. Picture a child staring at an empty desk. No paper in front of them, no abacus, just a blank surface and two hands moving in the air. Fingers counting, adjusting, landing, while their eyes track something invisible. Advanced abacus training in Chinese schools eventually removes the abacus entirely. The physical tool becomes a mental image that students learn to manipulate in real time. Researchers describe it as a method for expanding visuospatial working memory, the same cognitive resource used in reading maps, assembling objects, and holding complex instructions in sequence. The abacus isn't the point. The mental architecture the abacus builds is the point. The infrastructure exists. It works. The body is being trained alongside the mind, and nowhere is that more visible than in handwriting practice. Stroke order in Chinese character writing is not decorative. Each character has a prescribed sequence of strokes, and teachers correct not just whether the character is legible, but whether the hand moved correctly to produce it. Research widely links this kind of precise fine motor repetition to stronger memory encoding and reading comprehension. The physical act of correct formation appears to reinforce the neural pathway for recognition. Western handwriting instruction has narrowed significantly over the past 2 decades. The cognitive case for keeping it hasn't disappeared with it. The body is being trained alongside the mind, and that principle shows up in the schedule too. Walk past a Chinese school at 7:45 in the morning and look down from any elevated angle. What you see looks choreographed. Hundreds of children in a courtyard moving through synchronized calisthenics in clean rows. This is not gym class. It isn't recess. It's a structured daily reset timed deliberately before the first academic block of the day. The logic is physiological. Moderate, coordinated movement primes the prefrontal cortex for focused work. The scheduling decision reflects a specific understanding of how learning begins. Not when a student sits down, but what the body has done in the 20 minutes before. It's a principle Western schools have piloted in fragments, mostly as experimental programs, occasionally with strong results, rarely as standard policy. Coordination at scale turns out to require a skill most Western curricula quietly retired. This next one doesn't make sense until you see the numbers. Chinese schools treat memorization as a trainable capacity, not an innate ability some students have and others lack, but a skill that responds to structured practice the way muscle tissue responds to load. The curriculum is sequenced around that assumption. Students memorize early, in volume, across years, and the material they memorize is selected for its density and compactness. The distinction matters because it changes everything downstream. If memorization is a learning style, you accommodate it or you don't. If it's a capacity, you build it. And students who build it early have more cognitive bandwidth available for analysis and synthesis later. That's a different theory of how learning works, and it produces a different kind of student, which is exactly why classical text recitation isn't an elective. Open a Chinese language arts curriculum, and you'll find Tang Dynasty poetry, classical philosophical texts, passages written in a form of the language that is centuries removed from modern Mandarin. Students are expected to memorize them and recite them aloud. The purpose isn't reverence for antiquity, it's exposure to syntactic structures and compressed meanings that simplified modern texts don't provide. A student who has spent years parsing classical Chinese has encountered more grammatical complexity, more layered reference, more density per sentence than almost any contemporary reading diet offers. Western schools had a version of this too, built around Latin and classical rhetoric. They dropped it at a very specific moment in the 20th century for reasons that made sense at the time. What came with it is still being debated. Structure in writing turns out to mirror structure in something else entirely. Chinese secondary writing instruction teaches explicit argumentative architecture, not as an advanced elective, as standard curriculum, claim, evidence, reasoning, counter-acknowledgement, conclusion. The structure is modeled, practiced, corrected, and built into the grading criteria from early secondary school. Reports suggest Western writing pedagogy shifted heavily toward expressive and personal writing from the 1970s onward, prioritizing voice over form. The result is a generation of students who can write with personality, but often struggle to construct a formal argument under pressure. The architecture never got built because no one required it. China required it. The next one changes the logic entirely, and then China did something no one expected. It kept technical drawing in the general curriculum, not in vocational tracks, not as an optional elective. In middle school, as standard coursework, Chinese students still learn to render three-dimensional objects in two-dimensional space by hand, isometric projection, orthographic views, precise measurement without software. Western schools cut manual technical drawing in the 1990s when CAD became widely available. The reasoning was straightforward. Why teach the analog version of a skill when the digital version exists? What disappeared along with it, reports suggest, was the spatial reasoning training that came from translating a physical object into a flat image using only a pencil and a set of rules. CAD produces the drawing. Hand drafting builds the mental model that understanding the drawing requires. That assumption that understanding how things are made is general knowledge, not specialist knowledge, runs through Chinese manufacturing literacy education too. Students in Chinese general secondary schools spend time at workbenches, assembling components, understanding tolerances, recognizing the difference between a design on paper and a part that has to fit with another part in physical space. This isn't tracked into a vocational stream for students who aren't going to university. It sits inside the general curriculum, on the assumption that a person who has never made anything is missing a category of knowledge that no amount of theoretical instruction fully replaces. Western schools largely disaggregated this into shop class, then quietly defunded shop class across the 1980s and 1990s. The assumption that went with it, that making things is a thinking activity, largely went with it too. The thing is, this was already old news 3 years ago. Chinese schools widely teach jianpu, a numbered musical notation system that maps each note to a digit. An elementary student reading a jianpu score is doing something specific, translating a symbol into a sound, reading a sequence, recognizing a pattern, and producing an output in real time. It is literacy in a direct and technical sense. It is pattern recognition with immediate physical feedback. Reports suggest music education in Western schools has contracted significantly over the past 3 decades, and where it persists, it increasingly emphasizes performance by imitation rather than reading by notation. The structural thinking underneath jianpu, that a symbol system can be taught, decoded, and internalized, is the same thinking that underlies reading and mathematics. China kept the music, it kept the thinking underneath it, but it gets weirder. Timed collaborative problem solving is a structured format in Chinese classrooms. 4 students, 1 worksheet. A clock on the wall, 90 seconds. The time pressure is not incidental, it's pedagogical. Students learn to distribute cognitive labor under constraint, to communicate in compressed form, to make a decision before the ideal information is available. These are exactly the competencies that Western companies now pay consultants and executive coaches to develop in adult employees. We're talking about an entire industry. Workshops, retreats, facilitated sessions, built to install in 35-year-olds a skill that Chinese students practice before lunch on a Wednesday. The infrastructure exists, it works, and it was built into a curriculum, not a corporate off-site. Alongside that, Chinese classrooms use presentation and defensive work as a standard format. A student doesn't just present findings, they stand at the front while classmates hold written questions, and they answer. The feedback isn't passive, it's adversarial in a structured and constructive sense. Students learn to anticipate objections before they finish a task because they know the objections are coming. That anticipatory thinking, building a counter-argument into the original work, is what distinguishes a position from an argument. Western schools teach presentation. They rarely teach defense. The feedback structure underneath that practice turns out to be its own curriculum. That's not even the impressive part. Peer critique in Chinese classrooms is conducted with a rubric. Two students exchange papers, each holds a pen. Between them sits a printed set of shared criteria. The critique is structured, specific, and documented. Western schools widely report that structured peer feedback is one of the hardest collaborative skills to implement in adult professional environments because the adults in those environments never learn to give or receive criteria-based critique without taking it personally. That's not a personality trait, it's a trained capacity, and it wasn't trained. China trained it at 12. Under all of these methods, there is something that isn't a method at all. Chinese classrooms regularly externalize long-range progress into visible incremental milestones. A chart on the wall, check marks and columns, the distance between where a student started and where they are now made physically legible. The behavioral research on this is well documented. When progress is made visible in small units, students are more likely to continue. Delayed gratification becomes less abstract when it has a concrete, trackable form. Reports suggest this same scaffolding technique is now taught in corporate productivity training under different names: habit stacking, progress visualization, milestone mapping. China didn't call it anything, it just built it into the classroom wall. The concept underneath all of this has a name in Chinese educational culture: Qi, lesson time, and Qi, in the operational sense, is treated as inviolable. A parent waiting in a hallway doesn't knock, a phone call doesn't interrupt. The administrative logistics of a school day are arranged around protecting instructional time, not interrupting it. Reports suggest that Chinese students receive significantly more protected instructional minutes per year than students in most Western systems, not because their school days are necessarily longer, but because the time that exists is protected by a norm that policy alone hasn't managed to replicate. That norm didn't come from policy, it came from something older. It came in part from a cultural framework around effort, face, and public acknowledgement of improvement. Chinese classrooms broadly distinguish between recognizing effort and recognizing ability, and the distinction is made publicly, deliberately, and consistently. A teacher writes a student's name on the board not to mark a failure, but to mark visible improvement. The student sits straight. The class observes. The message isn't that this student is talented, it's that this student worked, and the work produced a result. That single distinction between praising what a person is and praising what a person did has significant downstream effects on how students respond when the work is hard and the result isn't there yet. Failure, it turns out, is also something Chinese schools explicitly teach, not as a concept but as a visible practice. Open a Chinese student's workbook and look at the pages. Wrong answers aren't erased, they're crossed out, and the corrected attempt appears in the same column, on the same page. The revision is visible, the struggle is legible. The workbook isn't a record of what the student knows, it's a record of how the student came to know it. Western workbooks tend to present clean final answers. Chinese workbooks present the process. That difference is pedagogical and it's structural, and it teaches something that no rubric explicitly names. that the path through wrong is the path to right. And the final layer isn't about school at all. Chinese education is structurally built around the assumption that family is a co-instructional partner, not a supplement, not a volunteer force, but a participant in the curriculum itself. Homework is designed to require parental involvement. Pacing assumes that a conversation about the material will happen at home. Parent communication from schools is frequent, specific, and treated as part of the educational infrastructure, not a courtesy. Western systems are beginning to pilot formal family engagement models at scale, and early results are being studied carefully. China didn't pilot it. It built the assumption in from the start, and the curriculum reflects it at every level. None of this is magic. All of it is a choice.